Have you ever admired a leader and wondered just what it is that makes her who she is? How he came to embrace the things that advanced him? Welcome to Timeless Leadership, where we look at the principles that define success. This is a show for leaders at all stages of their careers who aspire to understand what it truly means to be a leader. And who is a leader? Dolly Parton said, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader." Together, we'll explore key principles, not only in the sense of fundamentals, but also in the ethical sense, the habits, character traits, and virtues that form the backbone of leadership. Principles that are just as relevant and essential in the 21st century as they were in the first century. This is Timeless Leadership. Hello and welcome to Timeless Leadership, where we are in our second season exploring principles and virtues that accompany successful and admirable leaders. I'm Scott Monty, and if you aren't yet subscribed to the Timeless and Timely newsletter, where I regularly write about these leadership topics, please do so at www.timelesstimely.com. If you enjoy what you hear today, you can follow Timeless Leadership on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. This week, we are talking with Len Herstein about attentiveness. Success is a strange bedfellow. We have to strive hard to achieve our goals, and once we're on top of that peak, we breathe it in deeply, basking in the glory that's resulted from all that hard work. So it's hard not to just kick back and enjoy the fruits of our labor, the appreciation of a job well done. But when we let our guard down, that's when we invite risk and potentially damage the progress that we've made. It reminds me of a show early on in the second season, I think it was, of The Simpsons. Homer tried to jump Springfield Gorge on Bart's skateboard in order to teach him a lesson. The result was, well, as you would expect, a violent fall where Homer landed at the base of the canyon all bloodied and battered. And the rescue helicopter sent a stretcher down for him, and as it raised the stretcher with Homer on it, it swayed to and fro, and it smacked our hero's head against the side of the canyon the entire way up. The then delirious Homer was put into an ambulance on the back of a gurney, and two harried EMTs closed the doors, and the ambulance took off, immediately smashing into a tree. The unsecured doors in the back of the ambulance then opened up, the gurney rolled out, and Homer goes over the side of the canyon again with another horrific fall. In this case, it was after saving the victim that the EMT's lack of attention to detail, not securing the doors, well, not to mention avoiding the tree, resulted in a repeat tragedy. Now, it's precisely at these moments, I'd argue, that our vigilance should be even more heightened, lest we slip back down the side of the mountain that we just scaled. In 2015, Len Herstein became a reserve sheriff's deputy with the Douglas County Sheriff's Office in Colorado. In this volunteer position, he quickly learned the danger of complacency. Prior to that, Len had founded Manage Camp, producing 19 annual iterations of the brand Manage Camp Conference for marketers. His brand experience extended to Coca-Cola, the Campbell Soup Company, and Nabisco. It wasn't long before Len realized he was learning valuable lessons through his law enforcement training that could be applied directly back to business. Now, Len has developed actionable strategies to help business leaders in his new book, Be Vigilant, Stop Complacency, Improve Performance, and Safeguard Success. Len, welcome to Timeless Leadership.
Thanks, Scott. Man, it's already amazing. First of all, I feel like you could do movie promos. I love your movie promo voice. And anytime you can tie together anything I do with The Simpsons, I'm all in.
Well, hey, I think we're going to have a lot to talk about today then, Len. In a world where the Simpsons were ever vigilant. This is great. Well, happy book launch day. Today is the actual day that the book has been released to the public.
Yeah, thank you. It's unbelievable. I can't believe it's here. It's been 2 years since I had the idea and started writing, and man, feels like 10.
So help me understand how you began to bridge together your volunteer police experience, which began in 2015? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
To the business world. You still have Manage Camp and you run Brand Manage Camp as events for marketers and business leaders. Talk about the bridging of this concept of vigilance and how it came to you.
Yeah, it was interesting because it wasn't something that I went in thinking about. So, I got into law enforcement. I wanted to have an opportunity to give back to my community and make a positive impact. And this was the format that I found. And I went in thinking this was going to be a completely different experience than anything I've done in my life, which it was, obviously. But I was surprised at how quickly, from the very first day of being in the police academy, that I realized that there were some linkages here. When you become a police officer after, being in business for 25 plus years, you can't help but come in with that different lens of the world. And when I was sitting there and hearing about this idea, one of the first things they kind of tell us about is this idea that complacency kills. And obviously, that the meaning in that in law enforcement is immediate and understood. But I couldn't help but start thinking that complacency kills businesses, it kills brands, it kills organizations, and it kills personal relationships. And I became kind of obsessed with the concept in terms of understanding what complacency was and what we actually do in law enforcement to identify it and fight it on a daily basis with vigilance. And then, it just became clear to me that there were a lot of linkages back to business and life, and that's where the book came from.
That's fantastic. So help me understand, what is it about humans that makes us get complacent?
Well, the first thing is that we are very quick to become overconfident and self-satisfied when we experience success. And so, that's why one of the things that I talk to people about is this idea that, success is actually ironically, the thing that sometimes makes us the most vulnerable. And there's this idea that's called survivorship bias, where, you've seen the meme that says, hey, I survived lead paint and spankings and riding in the back of a station wagon with no seatbelt, and drinking from the hose, click like if you did too. Well, the reality is if you didn't survive that stuff, you can't click like. And so that's what survivorship bias is. Only the people that survived made it through. And if you attribute everything you did to that success, that will bias you and that will give you a false sense of security. And that's a human nature. And that's why complacency is always there. It's lurking in the background, waiting for those right conditions to pop up. And our job is to understand that and figure out how can we put it at bay.
Yeah, and you actually mentioned, after you leave the sheriff's compound there in Douglas County, there's a sign there to remind you about that every time you drive out. What's the sign say?
Yeah, so the sign is from an organization called Below 100. The idea is to try and keep law enforcement deaths below 100. We haven't done it in a really, really long time. And certainly we're not doing it this year, but it goes through several things: wear your seatbelt, wear your vest, watch your speed, what's important now. And it ends with this statement. And remember, complacency kills, right? Wow. And so it's one of those things that is driven into us every single day. And that's the reality of complacency, is that if you're not thinking about it, that's when it takes hold.
Yeah. That's so true. And, this notion of survivorship bias, we see it expressed in all kinds of things. You mentioned that meme, seatbelts certainly are a big one. You and I probably grew up in a generation that had to go from no seatbelts to seatbelts, probably even before we were drivers. So it's become ingrained in what we do. And I think, quite frankly, we're seeing it now with the pandemic. People are downplaying the deaths, even though there's been over 700,000 deaths now. They look at the rate of infection versus the rate of death, and they say, 97%, 99%, whatever it is. That's good enough for me, so I'm not going to protect myself anymore. I'm going to be complacent, basically. And they wear it as a badge of honor. How do you begin to combat something like that, where people prefer complacency to being aware and attentive and vigilant?
Yeah, I think there's a delineation there that when you're making that conscious decision as to how you're going to act, you've identified, you understand the potential threats, and you just interpret them differently. To me, that's a little different than you become so overconfident that you don't see the dangers, right? And so, the issue that I see as it relates to pandemic and everything that's going on is, and you'll see it is, it's very easy to be vigilant when things are going wrong. You don't, to tie it back to business, you don't see a lot of, bootstrapping startups maxing out their credit cards and working out of somebody's garage that are complacent, right? It's when that success comes in. It's when we start experiencing that level of comfort, that complacency. And it's amazing how quick it comes about, right? So we can, as soon as we start seeing some level of success or start feeling like we have, achieved something that pushes us beyond, reach of the virus, of the pandemic, we very quickly can get into a spot where we're overconfident and complacent and we ignore those threats. And so I do think that this is a great example of what's going on. I'm not sure that the people who are consciously deciding, which way they want to go, I don't know if I would put that in the world of complacency. That's just them, making different decisions.
Yeah. Very diplomatically put, Len. Congratulations. Well, and here's the thing, just to stay on the topic of the pandemic now, because I think this is a kind of a microcosm of exactly what it is you're talking about here. There are a number of contingencies that we can take up against it. Certainly vaccination is one. But there's masking, there's social distancing. I mean, we've seen them all. And I was just at a conference last week, first conference I've spoken at in over a year and a half.
Wow.
And we have a 7-year-old at home. She is unable to be vaccinated. So I was masked up as frequently as I could be in that situation. And I was astounded at the rest of the crowd. There was not another single mask wearer in the entire crowd. And I thought, wow, we're letting our guard down now that we've been vaccinated, thinking that is the ultimate protectant, when in fact there are layers of protection that we can take. There are lots of different contingencies we can take to mitigate the spread of the virus. And this, to me, seems to be very similar in your line of police work and in the lines of business, of all the things that we can be thinking about that can mitigate failure or catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that I talk about in the book that's important, I think, to kind of make the distinction between is, complacency, as we've talked about, is this idea of overconfidence and self-satisfaction and smugness that leads to an unawareness of danger, right? And sometimes people think that, they get a little confused about what the opposite of complacency is. And they think that maybe the message is that the opposite of complacency is paranoia, is the fear of all the things that could be out there, right? But really the opposite of complacency is vigilance, which is the awareness. It's the difference between being fearful and aware. I think part of the problem that we've had with this pandemic and everything that's going on is just the confusion around what we should be afraid of and what we should be aware of, right? And I think that leads to a breakdown in people's ability to process information, in their appetite to process information, right? And so a lot of the confusion, a lot of the lack of understanding as to, what is it that we need to be afraid of versus what is it that we need to be aware of, and how do we plan, and you talked about contingency plans, and scenario planning. How do we plan for those things that we need to be aware of? The problem is that, whenever we get into something where we're in the middle of a crisis, and one of the things I talk about in the book is the worst time to figure out what you're going to do in a crisis is when you're in the crisis, right? Because once you're in the crisis, if you haven't thought all this through, that's when panic ensues. And when panic ensues, that's when, that's when everything goes haywire, right? And I do think that's part of the problem we have is people have been, overloaded with so much information, and the ability to discern what is right and what is wrong and what is true and what is not has really kind of crossed everybody's wires and made people burn out.
Yeah. And I think we're beginning to feel some of that burnout already. And I love that delineation between paranoia and vigilance. I mean, it's a fine line, but the way you kind of constructed it there, of paranoia being fear-based, reminds me of the Joseph Heller quote from Catch-22. I've been saying this since college. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. So a healthy dose of awareness there, even when you are paranoid. So you mentioned, and I think this idea of crisis preparedness. I was part of a big brand, big company, Ford Motor Company. And we had our share of crises, certainly while I was there, before I was there, and after I was there. And it really is all about preparedness. And sometimes you never know what the next crisis is going to be. If we knew what crises were coming, then they wouldn't be crises. They seem to hit you from out of left field, and yet you still have to be prepared for them. Can you talk a little bit about how we can prepare for things even if we don't expect them?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Melissa Agnes wrote the preface to my book, and she actually runs something called the Crisis Management Institute. And that's all they do is they help businesses and governments prepare for crisis in terms of how they're going to react. And some of that is identifying what all the potential threats could be. And some of that is identifying how we're going to react to crises. I don't even know. You probably know the word. What's the better word?
Crises
or crises?
Yeah.
Crises. Okay. That come up that we didn't know about. Right. So it's as much about understanding how we're going to react and what our processes are for reacting as it is for identifying what they could all be. Because obviously we're never going to identify what they could all be, but we can identify a lot of them, right? And what happens a lot of time, especially in business, is that we get so focused on the threats that we're comfortable with that we forget about the others, right? I call it the roadrunner effect. It's when Wile E. Coyote gets so fixated on the roadrunner, but the roadrunner is never the thing that actually hurts him, right?
That's true.
We're
doing a lot of cartoon culture in this episode.
I love it. We got the Simpsons. We got the Roadrunner. Man, we need something a little more up to date though. We got to get like a SpongeBob or something. But that's the thing. Like we can get so fixated on what we think we know. If you think back to the cola wars, right, and Pepsi and Coca-Cola, so fixated on each other that they didn't maybe see energy drinks or Red Bull or water. Right. All those things that they then had to acquire later. Right. They were so busy thinking that the whole world was about Pepsi versus Coke that they lost sight of what was going on around.
That is so powerful, Len. These threats that we see, they usually don't hit us head on, do they?
No, they really don't. I mean, who would have thought that the disruptor and the biggest threat in the solar energy industry, the people putting solar panels on roofs, would be Elon Musk and Tesla.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's what happened, right? And people didn't see it coming. But they could have. They could have, right? And part of that is, like I said, number one, having people and processes in place whose job it is to identify threats, whose job it is to have a 360-degree awareness, to look at, current and future potential competitors, to look at where threats could come from government, regulation, environment, supply chain like we're having right now.
Yeah.
All right. All these are things that we need to have someone who has eyes on these and starts to identify what we might do if, right? What if, right? It's very simple. And we do it in law enforcement all the time. We have a plan for a lot of different things. So when I walk into I'm a kind of a pain to walk into a restaurant with. My family doesn't like it anymore because, I have specific places I'll sit, and I have to keep my eyes on things, but it's not because I'm paranoid. It's just, I like to have a view of where the threats could come from, especially since I police in an area where I live. Right. And so, it's important to not only have that view of where the threats can come from, but also have a plan for what you're going to do if they come about. And that's a big piece of this, but it's also about, like I said, understanding what we're going to do and how we're going to react if a threat comes up that we didn't foresee. And that's just as important.
That's great. Len, your background also includes some work with Anderson, which then went on to become Accenture. Mm-hmm. I would imagine you probably learned SWOT analysis there, SWOT, where you're talking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you mentioned assigning someone on your team to be responsible for threat analysis, threat awareness. What if you're a small business owner and you don't have the breadth of staff to handle that thing? How should you go about thinking about threats and heightening your vigilance?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because what always kind of fascinated me about the SWOT analysis is how much time we would spend on part of it, and then we would just it seemed like a lot of times we would just flip around to opposites. Like we'd come up with our strengths and the opposites of our strengths were our weaknesses, right? And we'd come up with our opportunities and the opposite of our opportunities were our threats. And, it seemed like, a lot of times an exercise that we were kind of sleepwalking our way through. What's important is to really, so say you're a small business, right? And you don't have, people to do that, but you have yourself, right? And, you have to put time in your calendar because the thing about complacency is that, again, it sneaks up on you, right? It's one of those things where, it's a difficult book to sell to people sometimes because, nobody walks around thinking they're complacent because if they did, they wouldn't be complacent. That's the definition of the whole thing, right? So, it's important to identify the fact that complacency is something that exists and that especially from a threat awareness standpoint, I have to put time on my calendar, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, to reevaluate, to question. One of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea of briefing and debriefing and making sure that we're debriefing even successful things that happen to us. But the key point there is to question everything, even when everything goes right, right? And so we have to question our assumptions. And, it used to be that we would plan yearly. We would do yearly plans. Well, the world moves way too fast for that anymore. We have to be questioning our assumptions. Doesn't mean we have to be replanning, but we at least have to have something that makes us question our assumptions at a more regular interval. Mm-hmm. And I think, if you're a small business owner and you're on your own, putting that time in your calendar, putting that hour or two every week to say, let me look for new threats. Let me actively look. What is going on out in my industry, in adjacent industries, in, the environment again, geographical stuff, governmental stuff. What is happening out there so I can spend that time? Because otherwise, especially if you're a small business and you don't have the people, you're going to let yourself, your time is going to slip away, right? You're going to get sucked into a million different things. And you really have to be purposeful and intentional about putting the time away for that questioning of assumptions around threats.
Yeah. And that, you know what, Len, you're doing a great job of helping me promote the show because our first episode this second season was all about intentionality. So we're seeing, I think, kind of a recurrence of themes here. And to me, this idea of reflection or meditation spending quiet time, it's so important because we are constantly being interrupted. We are pulled in so many directions, so many notifications on our phones. It seems like in one way or another, we're almost running from ourselves, keeping ourselves busy, scrolling through with our thumbs, doom scrolling, as it were, or just zipping from one thing to the next. And I would imagine that when we think about debriefing and when we're remembering, which I know is another key component in the book, it can be hard. It's almost like post-traumatic stress disorder. When we go through an analysis of why we failed or what happened, it can be traumatic. And it's human nature to want to avoid that kind of thing. And what I hear you saying is it's even more important to drill down and understand that, to be able to kind of leapfrog ahead and avoid it happening again.
Yeah. And I would even argue that it's even more important to do it when things go right, when you have success. If when I talk to people in business and I ask them, do you do debriefs right now? Do you debrief things that happen in your organization? And inevitably the answer will be yes, but, right? The answer is yes, we debrief. And when I dig deeper, what we find is that they debrief when things go wrong, right? Something goes wrong and it becomes an exercise in trying to figure out what went wrong. And a lot of times in assigning blame. Whose fault was it, right? Why did this go wrong?
Yeah.
How do we make sure it doesn't go wrong? The problem is, because it's uncomfortable and because we don't love debriefing and because we don't love doing it, right? When things go right, when we have a success, we don't normally think about going through that process. And here's the problem, right? The problem is that we can have successes that could have been more successful, right? We can have successes in which we had many failures, but the end result was success. We can have successes that were purely by luck or because someone else on a competitor's team messed up, right? So, what I tell people is you want to be Tom Brady, right? You want to be the guy who at the end of the game, no matter what, is going back and looking at that tape, looking for what can we do differently? What went right? What went right but went right by accident? What went right but could have gone better? And what did we actually do wrong that kind of got hidden by the fact that the end result was right? Right? And so, that process to me is where we fight complacency, because it's easy to do it when things go wrong. It's very obvious. But we don't often do it when we have positive results.
Yeah. And I'm curious, as a Denver Broncos fan, are you allowed to quote Tom Brady?
I was going to throw in Peyton Manning there, but since Peyton Manning, we haven't had a quarterback that lasted more than 8 minutes. So
that's all right. That's all right. And I love that quote, Len. I put it there up on the marquee. Vigilance is questioning everything, even when everything goes right. It's such a powerful reminder. Can you talk a little bit about the role of storytelling and how we tell each other stories and how that pertains to this notion of vigilance?
Well, I think part of the purpose of stories in life and in history, right? So, nobody knows stories more than you. And that it's always so interesting talking to you and, just being able to pull stories from all different eras and all different times and all different types of literature. But a lot of times the purpose of stories is to help us remember, right? The purpose of stories is to help us remember and to help us learn. And, part of that is related to the fact that we like to forget. As humans, our brain is programmed to forget. Otherwise, we'd go crazy, right? And so we like to forget things that are negative, we like to forget, painful things, right? And we like to forget, things that can really help us be more successful in the future because it's uncomfortable. And so, when you talk about stories, I talk about, reminders. To me, that kind of relates back to this chapter in the book about reminders and about how do we make sure that we don't forget the things that we need to remember. but our brain would rather forget. And whether that's, Greek mythology or, any of the other stories that you deal with. I mean, in my world, what that a lot of times relates to is how do I create stimuli in my life, in my day, that immediately brings me back to a story in my own head. And that's why, like, right now I'm wearing a little silicone bracelet on it. It says Be Vigilant, right? Because I forget, I wrote the book called Be Vigilant, and I still am not vigilant all the time, right? And when I feel that bracelet, I don't even have to look at it. I know what it says. When I feel it, I put my hand on it. I question myself. I think to myself, what am I doing right now? What am I missing? What should I be thinking about? And that comes from something we do in law enforcement a lot. Like, we have, this idea of the little bracelet came from, we have bracelets to commemorate people we've lost or, people who have been, severely injured. And, I wear those around on my belt, around my handcuff case. And, I don't even have to look at them or anything. When I put my hand on them, the tactile feel of that brings me back to the story in my mind and teaches and reminds me of what I needed to learn from it so that none of this happened in vain. And those are the stories for me.
Yeah.
It's about having those stories, but also about reminding ourselves to think about them.
Yeah. I mean, it's human nature to just keep plowing forward. And, even the Stoics, if you follow Stoic philosophy, one of their things is having a Mementomori, which is typically a physical reminder. Could be something we keep on our desk, something we keep in our pocket, but it's a reminder that we are mortal and that our time here is limited and that there are things that we need to be aware of. And, it's a powerful thing, whether you reach your hand into a pocket and, feel a coin that signifies your memento mori or look across to a shelf or whatever. So I think that's very consistent with what you're talking about, Len.
Yeah. It reminds me of, in the book, I talk about one of my favorite movies is Memento.
Ha! Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, well, what was it? It was Guy Ritchie, right? Yeah. Guy Ritchie and the movie is just so interesting because it kind of moves, the way it manipulates time and works backwards, but it's basically about a guy who has memory, short-term memory loss and finds and has to solve some sort of murder and has to leave himself notes, whether it's tattoos that he gets put on his body or, things that he leaves for himself to help him remember. And these mementos kind of work him backwards through the entire movie until, I won't reveal the ending. If you haven't seen it, you should definitely see it. Great movie.
It's a powerful movie. It's got one of those wow endings like The Usual Suspects. So, it definitely has an effect. So, well, that's a great example, a great reminder of why this is so important. Now, Len, you say your business and relationships depend on it. Talk a little bit about the relationship aspect and why vigilance is important in relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the places that we're most complacent in life is in our relationships. We take them for granted, right? Because, quite often, you don't really realize that they're going bad until it's too late, right? You've neglected them, whether it's a friend or a loved one or, a spouse or a child. We take we get overconfident in those relationships and we don't spend the time thinking about, where could the threats come from? How do we, debrief and brief and make sure that we're building on the strengths of our relationships and identifying the potential weaknesses? What are the reminders that we put in place to teach us to remain present and in the moment and all the things we have to do, being accountable and there's so many ways that, when I look at relationships that fail, whether it's in my own life or in other people's, most of the time you can tie that back to some level of complacency. People who had really strong relationships that deteriorated, it was because they lost touch with what was going on. And a lot of that stems from some overconfidence.
Yeah. Or simply taking each other for granted. Assuming that it's always going to be the same or someone's always going to be there for you. Things happen in life. We experience tragedy and loss. We experience joy and success. we can move in different directions. And if we don't kind of keep our finger on the pulse of the relationships that matter to us, then they can certainly be negatively affected. So I think that's a really great observation. So, Len, talk a little bit about metrics. I know we were just talking there about kind of determining your KPIs, your levels of success. I think we need to know what we're going to measure if we're going to determine whether we're successful or not. But you have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to metrics around vigilance. Can you talk through that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I talk about in the book, so that the chapter is actually kind of around this idea that just because there's no bleeding, or just because you don't see blood doesn't mean there's no bleeding, right? And what it gets, it kind of goes back to some things that I've learned in law enforcement, but really what it gets to is, are we looking at the right metrics? I was just talking with someone else before I got on this call today, and was talking about this idea that we have so much data available to us. And back in the day, before we had all that data, we thought that was going to be the answer to everything. But sometimes the data leads us in the wrong direction, and we can misuse metrics. Metrics can actually help us become complacent if we're using them the wrong way, right? So one of the ways that we can use them wrong is if we're using too many of them. Sometimes we use way more metrics than are helpful in allowing us to make the right decisions. In the book, I kind of relive the story told by Malcolm Gladwell in Blink about the Chicago ER, where they were having a hard time correctly identifying people who were coming in with heart attacks. And the problem was they were looking at all the wrong things. And what they found out is that if they focused on, I believe it was four metrics that had nothing to do with what the person looked like, the color of their skin, their age, how overweight or underweight they were, had nothing to do with any of that. It was four specific metrics. They immediately became significantly better able to identify people who were actually coming in with heart attack. Whereas before, they would look at the person, they would say, okay, well, this person's elderly and they're overweight and they're a smoker and all these things. And so, I don't really know, but they're probably having a heart attack. All those extra metrics led them down the wrong path. So that's one way that we misuse metrics that can help us become complacent. The other thing that we do a lot of times is we use the wrong metrics. And, another author, Eric Ries, he talks about this idea of vanity metrics that are set up to make us feel good, right? Like clicks or, opens or things, like things that don't necessarily translate back to engagement or, our end goal, which is making a sale or whatever we're trying to accomplish, right? And so a lot of times we can get distracted by vanity metrics that allow us to become overconfident when they're not really relating back to what we want to do. And then a third way that metrics can really get in the way of what we're doing is when the metrics incentivize us to do the wrong thing. I tell the story, I know you love stories, and you probably know the Cobra effect story, maybe in colonial India, where they were trying to fix a cobra problem. They had a lot of cobras. And so they put a bounty out on cobras. Well, what happened was the enterprising people of colonial India started breeding cobras so that they could then kill them and get the bounty. And then when they finally figured that out and they ended the bounty, they were left with infinitely more cobras than they had before they started.
That's a great story, great example. Sometimes we don't think through the full impact of what our incentive process is.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of times people will say, well, those are unintended consequences. And in my mind, there's no such thing as unintended consequences. There's just consequences that weren't considered.
Unanticipated, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, this is kind of reminiscent of my early days at Ford. When Alan Mullally got there a couple of years before I did, he instituted a process every Thursday called the Business Plan Review, or BPR.
Mm-hmm.
And what it was designed to do was to create accountability within the organization, because before that, people were kind of blaming each other and just kind of going along. So every executive had to show up and report out on his or her division and exactly where they were with regard to the plan. Red, yellow, or green, whether they were off plan, moderate, or succeeding. Mm-hmm. And what that did is it created a moment every Thursday of complete transparency across the entire Ford Motor Company globally. So in 3 hours, you knew exactly where the company was heading and what it needed to focus on in order to improve. And look, you've got people in those meetings who are talking about threats, who are talking about competitive interests, et cetera. So it really became a crystallizing process. And in your own book here, you talk about accountability and transparency, and I was really astounded to see that. Can you talk a little bit about why accountability and transparency are important with respect to the concept of vigilance?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk a lot about that, and I think it's important. It's really important. Obviously in the era we are and the relationship that the public has with law enforcement right now, it's become even more clear, right? In terms of, the value of accountability and transparency. And for me, I call it the ATV model: accountability plus transparency equals vigilance. So vigilance comes from the combination of those two things. And so first you have to have accountability. You have to publicly identify what you're going to stand for and how you're going to measure that, right? And it's so important these days because what happens is we live in a world where trust has been eroded, right? Over time, we've eroded trust. And what that results in is what I call it is, what I talk about is I say, we now live in a world where we don't have the benefit of the doubt. Back in the day, when something went wrong, we didn't immediately assume the worst about people or organizations. We gave people the benefit of the doubt. But that's kind of gone these days because of that lack of trust. The immediate assumption when something happens, especially if there's no information out there, if there's an information gap, people will immediately fill that in with the most negative potential answer they can find, right? It's just human nature now. And so part of combating that is holding yourself accountable, right? Is putting out what you're going to measure yourself by. But then the second piece of that is being transparent about those measurements, of being transparent about how you are progressing along with the things that you are holding yourself accountable for and providing that information. The combination of those two things does a few different things. Number one is it helps build that trust, so that perhaps you can earn some of that benefit of the doubt so that people don't always assume that you're out there doing the worst possible thing you could be doing. It also, by putting that out there, forces you to be more vigilant, forces you to be more in the moment, understanding what's going on, paying attention to the potential threats that are out there, because you know that you will be held accountable and that you will have to provide that transparency. So just putting the process in place makes you more vigilant. And then that vigilance creates a much more positive environment and a much more positive relationship, with your constituents.
I love that. And this concept that when there's an information gap, we automatically assume the worst. I mean, you see that in so many instances across businesses, across relationships, and we could help ourselves a little bit if we're not going to hew to the accountability and transparency that you talk about. Well, at least know that most people are not evil. Most people's hearts are in the right place. Sometimes it's hard to remind ourselves of that every day, but that could be a really good start.
So, yeah. Well, and it's something that has been, really prevalent in the world of law enforcement, right? I mean, there is no quicker way to have the assumption of guilt from the law enforcement side in terms of how people view them than to not have a body camera, than to not have captured footage of what went wrong. Because the assumption at this point, unfortunately, because of the erosion of trust, is that whatever happened, if it wasn't captured on video, was probably malevolent.
Yeah. And look, until the advent of body cameras and other security cameras and whatnot, the average citizen really didn't understand what police officers went through. I mean, I'm sure you saw both sides of it once you became a volunteer sheriff's deputy. Some of your assumptions were probably completely blown out of the water.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, once you're on this inside of anything, of course, you see the realities better. I mean, the good thing for me is I never policed in a world without body cameras. So my department has been using body cameras since very, very early on, and I love them. I absolutely love them. I think they're great. But like you said, there are things that you can never know about any profession until you're inside.
So, Len, as we wrap up here, what's the single most powerful piece of advice you can give to people with regard to staying aware of their attentiveness and being vigilant in what they do?
So, I mean, the first step is just being aware, right? So making yourself constantly understand the awareness of the potential vulnerabilities that come with complacency, and that awareness, just that paying attention to it immediately makes you more vigilant. But for me, if I had to tell people one thing about what I'm trying to accomplish with the book and what this can do for you, it's this idea that the end goal is not success. The end goal is keeping that success. And so that's what this is all about. This is most relevant for people who have experienced some level of success in their lives or in their business. And this is about how do we make sure that success doesn't make us vulnerable? How do we make sure that we have a plan of vigilance? And the book has 10 specific vigilance strategies that you can use right away to help you identify complacency and put it at bay with vigilance so that you can protect that success you've worked so hard to attain.
Such a powerful reminder. Success is not the goal. Keeping it is. Len Herstein, author of Be Vigilant, Strategies to Stop Complacency, Improve Performance, and Safeguard Success. Your business and relationships depend on it. Where can people find out more about your book and you?
So if you just go to lenherstein.com, lenherstein.com, or bevigilantbook.com, you can get all the information and all the links are there. You can buy it today on Amazon, or Barnes & Noble or Apple Books, or wherever you buy your books, you can most likely get it. And then I would also encourage people to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. It's just Len Herstein. If you just search for Len Herstein on LinkedIn, reach out, connect with me. And I love hearing the stories. I mean, I just took notes on your story about what you guys did at Ford with the business plan review. And I just love to hear about, people's stories about where they think they're complacent in their own lives and their own business and what they're doing about it. And please connect with me. I'd love it.
That's fantastic. Lots to think about, no doubt. Well, Len, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's always awesome talking to you. You're one of my favorite people, and I appreciate you having me on the show.
All right. Successful leaders know that success is not survival, and that threats always loom. Only by being aware, attentive, and vigilant in moments of calm, as well as in moments of crisis, will leaders be ready for what awaits. Thank you for joining us and for being an advocate for timeless and principled leadership, whenever and wherever you find it. I'm Scott Monty. Until next time, may you dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, for you are a leader.